I absolutely adore this piece for so many reasons.
And I just think, what's the point?
I get that joke. I understood that reference. Feel like who art ed?
Try to slice it.
Who art ed? Mr. Wood art ed me.
Yeah. Either way, it's ambiguous. It works on so many levels.
I know.
That's off to a great start.
Welcome. In every episode, we are going to look at art in 3 parts. In situ, where we're going to look at the context in which it was created. In gallery, where we're going to have a discussion closely examining one specific masterpiece. And finally, in studio, where we will share our takeaways.
So today I am here with Highlands Elementary's LC Director Extraordinaire, Mr. Kressel.
Great to be here.
And we are going to be looking at George Seurat Sunday on La Grande Jatte. See, this is where I lose like all my pretentiousness street cred as we find out that I do not really speak French and cannot pull off the accent. I might as well just fully butcher it and Americanize it like Sunday on La Grande Jatte, a Sunday on La Grande Jatte, or Sunday on La Grande Jatte. It's a Sunday in the park. It is the Pointillist masterpiece from 1884 by George Seurat, currently housed at the Art Institute of Chicago, my old alma mater.
Now for our in situ segment, it just gives us some context. It's about the artist and where this came from. It's just a fancy way of saying back where this all came from.
And I think it's really important when looking at an artist or their work to think about the original context in which it was created. So George Seurat was painting at the end of the 19th century. The Sunday afternoon painting came about, he started it in 1884, and he finished painting it around May of 1886. So he spent about 2 years working on this painting. And in the process, he created numerous drawings or studies along the way to creating this final masterpiece. The finished work is 2 by 3 meters, which is 7 by 10 feet. So 7 feet tall, 10 feet wide. And it is all composed of those tiny little dots. Seurat was a pointillist, although in his time he liked the term divisionism for his approach of painting, focusing on small individual dots of different hues that were juxtaposed or put next to each other, and the human eye would blend those colors from a distance. He wasn't blending them with his paintbrush. He chose to use the viewer's eye and optics to blend the colors. And this is kind of an interesting development in painting that I think coincides nicely with a bit of the science at the time. The 19th century was a time of a lot of innovation, a lot of progress scientifically. The mid-19th century is when Daguerre made his photographic process available to everyone. So at that time, there was a lot of interest and a lot of focus on optics and the ways that images are created. Seurat was really interested in optics or the way that we see things, just like Impressionists in general were interested in optics and the way we see and the way we perceive light and color. One advancement that seems very, very simple in terms of technology, but it was a game changer for artists, was the tube of paint. That's another invention that came about in the 19th century. Prior to the tube of paint, artists would often use a pig's bladder to hold their paints, or they would use sometimes glass jars. Now, the problem with the bladder system was, aside from the ick factor, there is just a limited shelf life. Generally, your paints would dry out within about 2 days of that. So when tubes of paint came around that were mass-produced in a wide array of colors and they were portable, that's when you saw a shift where more artists liked to get out of their studio and paint in plain air. They went out to the park to make a study of what people were doing on a Sunday afternoon.
Now for our in-gallery segment, we're going to have a discussion looking more carefully at one piece.
Let's start off with just first impressions. What do we think of this piece?
What I see here is looks like a lot of different people who are near a park. There's some water. They all kind of seem to be doing their own thing. A lot of relaxing going on in here. They're very well dressed all over. It doesn't look like it's any time current.
See, I just look at this and I think, like, what's the point? Get it? Like pointillism?
Oh, yeah. Well, Seurat was pointillism. So I wonder if part of it is just like a proof of concept. Like we can do big, huge works like this using tiny, tiny little dots. I don't have the patience for creating that type of artwork. So I wonder if for Seurat that was part of it.
So I'm going to be honest, I would not have the patience for this kind of thing either. I believe that this took about 2 years to paint because the overall piece is 10 feet wide and it is all painted with tiny little dots. A part of this is he was really interested in color theory and some books that were written by chemists about how you could, I believe it was in the context of restoring tapestries and things like that, but a chemist wrote about how you couldn't match the color on its own. You had to match it relative to what was around it, because as the colors sort of mixed, your eye would blend them, and like two near colors would optically mix to create like a third color.
Well, and that makes a lot of sense with what we know about how color works in all types of print now. Back in those days, this was kind of proof of concept. If you ever look at comic strips or really close up at certain pieces under a microscope even, you can see it's the same kind of concept happening. You have different dots that are actually next to each other that are combined to give the eye the appearance of a specific color.
And that's basically the same thing we have happening when we look at like the pixels on our screens. And I like that microscope analogy because it sort of has to do with how Seurat thought of this as divisionism. That is the term that he used, sort of thinking about dividing it up into smaller and smaller and smaller chunks of pigment that were then optically mixed.
It also kind of lends itself to this discussion of fugitiveness within art and the idea of being able to seek that color and where is it and how do we get it to where we want to do it. It's hard to capture sometimes.
Did you and I listen to the same NPR story this morning?
We sure did. But I felt very, very smart saying it.
About fugitive colors in the pastel world.
Well, and I think this this landscape really lends itself to that when you bring in that idea of the chemistry of it. How do we capture those colors that we're really, really looking for when we're doing dots that are really hard to see and then stepping back and looking forward at it in terms of scale. I think about the movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off, which you can only see when your parents are with you. If it continues to zoom in and zoom in and zoom in, you really start to see the separation of color. But when you stand back, you get this completely different viewpoint on this painting.
It really is sort of like the original old school lo-fi, like 8-bit graphic celebration of color and painting in art. And just for context, when we say old school, we're talking about the mid to late 19th century is when he was painting. Now, shifting a little bit from how this was made and how he painted it and just the ridiculous dedication he had to painting this with tiny, tiny little dots, what do you think the overall point of this?
You got to stop saying point.
But why would he spend 2 years painting this particular composition? Why would he make it on this scale, do you think?
Well, I think there's two reasons for it. One, the artist proof of conception, like the proof of concept. I can do this, it can be done, and it can be successful. I think that's a really important key to say. He's trying something new. Seurat was kind of a pioneer in this field. He wasn't the only one experimenting with this, but he wanted to show that this type of art could be done on a large scale and could be really successful. The other thing I think about when I look at this is I think he's trying to do some commentary on what society is like at this time. We're in France. I don't remember off the top of my head when this painting was completed. Do you? 1817.
Exact year I don't know. This is in line with the Impressionist movement, which was the late 19th century.
Okay, so late 1800s.
Late 1800s, yes. And one of the things when you talk about society at that time, one of the shifts that happened with the Impressionists was they started painting just what and who they saw around them in everyday life. So this is sort of what a gathering of people would do in their leisure on a Sunday afternoon. And while to us that seems like, well, of course, you're going to paint what you observe around you in your everyday life, that was in some ways a shift from previous conceptions of what I'm painting on a large scale should be someone and something of massive historical importance. So, it was the shift to the everyman.
So this is basically like the Instagram, social media, this is what's going on in my life today shift in art.
Yes.
As opposed to like sitting down for a school picture, this is like, hey, I'm at the park today, what's up?
Yes, except instead of snapping a selfie in a fraction of a second, he spent 2 years and made like 50 or 60 rough drafts before completing this final work.
Well, we're still looking at it today, Mr. Woods, so I think that's something to kind of really keep in mind that, yes, he created this in this idea, but we're still talking about it.
It is interesting. It does sort of hold our attention today. It holds a spot of prominence in the Art Institute of Chicago, and as you said, prominence in pop culture with one of my favorites from my teenage years. Now, if you could take it out of the Art Institute, where would you like to see this painting?
That's an interesting question. I think when I look at this painting, I'm always drawn to the girl in the middle because she is the only one that's facing us. Everyone else is to the left, to the right, or their backs are to us. And I wonder if that's just, I know it's on purpose. I think that it draws kids in as well. When they say, hey, look at this. This is the only one that's really paying any attention to us. I could see this in a children's museum. I could see this hanging in a mural format or a print format walking into or near parks, because I think it captures the spirit of a park is for everyone. We're all here. We're all allowed to go to the park. There's no fees. There's no charges to get in and be like, hey, $2 to get into the park today. Sunshine and trees are free here.
That's interesting because I agree. This to me feels like it should be a public art. It should be a mural somewhere. Like I would love to see this like as the backdrop to the Crown Fountain in Millennium Park or something like that. I find it funny. You're drawn to the little girl in the center. I'm drawn to her too, but mostly out of frustration because I feel like she is confronting the viewer and yet her face is so low contrast and the features are so poorly defined. Like I wish there were just a little bit more contrast, some darker shadows.
But that's the idea of the Impressionism. That's where the Impressionist piece comes in. I also wonder if it's the idea of politeness in this time of society. Everyone else is averting their eyes or looking away, but as a child, that naivete, she's like, what is this guy doing? You know, he's kind of staring at us. Like, we know that little kids will do sometimes when we're trying. Everyone else is like, shh, we don't say that, or we don't do that, or say, excuse me. And you get the little kids who come in and say things. Maybe this is Seurat's way of having, that defiant child.
It could be. Or it could just be that we're both wrong and she's just looking at the woman with the pet monkey. Because that's pretty awesome, and I don't know how we've gone this long without talking about her.
I mean, who doesn't love a pet monkey?
And now for our in-studio segment. Think about what strategies are working.
Take it. Good
Make
artists
it your own.
copy. Great artists steal.
Just go ahead, steal this art.
Make it your own.
These are the takeaways. This is what you can apply to your own work.
So the first takeaway that I had with this piece is the dedication to the craft. Mr. Wood, you talked about how there were so many different drafts of this piece that he did along the way to create this large piece. And I think if there's anything that you can spend that much time on and that much dedication to it, that persistence, that vision that you have, it deserves to be a piece of art that withstands the test of time.
And one thing I would point out, if you enjoy pointillism, I'm saying point way too many times, but if you enjoy pointillism and want to explore this technique, you might consider using the back of your brush to make dots because you can get tighter, more defined dots using the handle of the brush to dot the paint instead of the bristles on the brush.
I think I can't be at a podcast without talking about literacy and the understanding of how do we translate stories, because stories are all around us. So the other takeaway that I had for this piece was the story, trying to interpret this story for us. We look at graphic novels, we look at picture books, we find ways to tell our own story within this story. And so when I look at this beautiful, because I still love it, piece, I see different stories happening. And of course, I mentioned that my eye is drawn to the girl. I want to know what her story is. Is she being defiant? Is it just because Seurat decided to include somebody like that to tell us, hey, we can do faces too, and this is the not landscape, but impressionist version of it? There's a lot of stories in here. In fact, I forgot to mention, this has been turned into a stage play musical type piece, right?
Yes, this has been adapted in many, many ways. It is popped up in movies, on the stage, and in children's cartoons that my young ones watch. And, on that note of what I hear you saying is you like seeing action that are stories, but also a little bit of ambiguity so that the viewer, like the reader, can use their imagination to interpret it in different ways. I
know there's a lot of references to this. I would love to see what students come up to tell the story of this picture. Who are these characters? Pick someone out of here and write about it.
Yeah. And I guess the final takeaway that I'm going to point out is I think it is a good strategy for an artist to put unexpected details in to draw people's attention, like a woman with a pet monkey. Let's end it with that.
Absolutely. Mr. Wood art ed me.
Thank you.
You're welcome.